This week, we are discussing blockchain's humanitarian benefits and use cases. Some of these use cases include ID creation and management, microfinance services, faster fund transfers, donation transparency, reliable land registries, and last but not least, migration of documents. And I'm joined now by Lucia Gallardo, whose work has proven these use cases are working right now. She is also the CEO of Emerge, which has been nominated for numerous awards, and a top MIT Innovator Under 35. Welcome to the show, Lucia.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Pleasure to have you on the show with the amazing work that you've done in your home country. And if you would, let us know, your background, your home country, and some of the specific things blockchain technology has done in your immediate community.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Honduras, first language being Spanish, and very, very Latin American, fiercely, proudly Latin American. But a lot of my work has actually spanned a couple of continents now because of the very nature of the utility blockchain offers in these domains that you've talked about. So, some of my work has revolved around ID management, but some of the key questions around ID and identification in countries where perhaps being identifiable has not served some population segments has been really important to consider in designing these kinds of systems. We have benefited a fair bit from using functional-based ID systems for migration and undocumented persons, for microfinance, and also for validating a lot of the existing organization that farmer communities might have around the world. We've got a project in Uganda that essentially verifies the land claims that communities have made and have been operating under for years. So it's not about going and sending surveyors to map the land, but rather really focusing on what the community has already structured and then building around that. And in Latin America, we've done a fair bit of work in DID for the purposes of immigration of undocumented migrants and making sure that they have more options and some sovereign identification documentation.
Oh, yeah, beautiful. And the work that you've done, like you just stated, in Latin America has been very beneficial. And I want to ask you, tell us a little bit about your projects in Mexico. You had a huge project there with helping people with IDs and different things where blockchain can solve those issues. Tell us a little bit about your work in Mexico.
Sure. So this was done in collaboration with Penta Network, which is one of Emerge's long-term partners. We essentially wanted to validate an approach of functional-based ID for the purpose of employment-based migration. I don't know how much people know about, undocumented immigration processes, asylum claiming, refugee protected status, but they're very complex processes that are actually highly documented. There are some major problems in the way that this process is done, though. The first is that if you're thinking about the digital identity framework, a lot of the questions that people are asked revolve around the notion of, who are you? Who do you claim to be? And so if I'm saying I'm Lucia Gallardo, how much of that can be verified as true? So are you in fact who you say you are, being the second question. The third question, revolves largely around why you are displaced, why you might be looking for asylum or immigration process pathway. And then also some questions around what's your criminal background check? And, are you a safety risk to the community that might consider welcoming you in? Now, in my view, this is a really undignified process because it doesn't allow people to frame their identity as value add. It's really like a burden narrative of, do you have a criminal background check? Are you a risk? What's your displacement? And will we have the kindness in us to allow you into our country? And so this narrative really informs a lot of public opinion and how people are welcomed to a community, how often they're welcome to a community. I'm not sure how much people look at these statistics, but, just by conflict alone, we have about 79 or 80 million people that are displaced. And the amount of people that actually get resettled within a year is around 100,000, 102,000. So it's a very, very low quota. And we have a lot of people that are continuously displaced. Now, Mexico, of course, is a country that receives a lot of migration from Central America. And most people assume that that's because they're on their way to the United States. But actually what we discovered was that there's a lot of variance in where people are intending to go. And Mexico's policy around humanitarian migration that is labor focused was a very big reason why actually a lot of people ended up wanting to stay in Mexico. So we were there to test this concept of a functional based ID that allowed people to tell us a little bit about themselves in a more holistic way. What are some of the labor skills and experience that they might have, even if that's a low skilled job, like even if it is restaurant, experience that would not be considered priority immigration policy in some countries, but is still very needed in every single economy in the world. That's an experience that is relevant and value add to a community. So we allowed ourselves to understand more about their employment and economic experiences. And then we also allowed ourselves to learn more about their social cultural priorities. You don't want to send, a Mormon to San Francisco because that community might not be the most welcoming community for them, but they might have a better fit or experience in a different community that has more of a culture that they might appreciate. And if that's important to them, that will impact the way that they're able to better resettle in a particular community. So we need to consider all of these factors. So we assessed those in very simple forms, paper-based largely because that's what we were dealing with on the user side. But then what we did was we ran some of those experiences across a database of employment. And so we saw, a fit between 15,000 possible job openings in Mexico and between what these skills were. And then we did some matching, and people were able to receive a job offer from one of those 15,000 job openings because we had received permission from those companies that were offering those openings to actually hire on their behalf. And so, you'd walk in as a person without documentation, you'd walk out with a job offer, and then you'd go to the respective consulate of your country, which in this case was Honduras, and you could receive certain documentation. So your birth certificate, a letter certifying you were in fact a Honduran citizen, your criminal background check, and a photograph. And then you would take all of that and you would fill out one more form in the Migration Mexico Center. And by 48 hours, you could already have a humanitarian work permit valid up to a year. So what we were really studying is the impact of digital identification that is functional, that really has a purpose in the nature of the data that we collect, and how that can inform human movement around the world with a lot more dignity than we currently treat a lot of the world's displaced populations. And that was really the goal of our work there. We ended up doing some really fun work around traceability and recording stories because we knew that the media was covering them with a lot of bias. So we were also very cautious about how these stories and testimonies were used. But the nature of the work was really understanding how to build DID systems where identity has not necessarily served a particular population segment in a positive way.
Oh yeah, and when you say DID systems, I want my viewers to know that means decentralized identification. All right, so that leads right to my next question. Do you think with the DID programs that there may be some regulators or maybe people in government that may try to centralize it more because you do want to protect your own data, but we do also know that data is very valuable. So if others want it, do you think at some point they could try to interfere with the process or take it over? Or do you think decentralized IDs should be the standard going forward no matter what?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of people are thinking about this in a very big way. So I've participated in a fair bit of like roundtables with the UNDP, thinking about how the UNDP being the United Nations Development Program, thinking, how do we think about ID moving forward? And there are many phases in which we have to think about identity because number one, every human being has the right to assert certain aspects of their identity, that you have the right to claim that you are in fact a person, that you are a citizen of the world and therefore merit respect of your human rights and human dignity, that you have a particular citizenship that affords you certain responsibilities and rights according to where you were born, that you have the right to migrate because it is a human right. And so these questions of where does the individual actually establish sovereignty in what they're able to claim? But then there's another side of this, which is verification. And, these standards of, in order to qualify for migration into the United States or into Honduras or into France, each country has the sovereignty to establish different, metrics, one could say, of who they allow in there. And so a real question that we have to ask ourselves as we design these decentralized identity systems is, number one, are we issuers of ID? And if so, what type of ID profiles are we trying to create? And what is the function and the utility and the value of creating this? Does it really need to exist? Because identity data is obviously extremely sensitive. And so if you don't really have a purpose in the marketplace of what you're doing with this data and what the the value add will be to the lives of the people that create profiles on your platform, then, we really have to think about that, whether you should exist or not at all. So the first question is, are you an issuer? Are you creator of identification documentation? And the second question is, if you're not, then are you a verifier? And where does the private sector and the public sector and all of these different, bodies come in and out of these kinds of systems? And so I like to think about collaboration, not just vertically, because we're talking about a tech stack that involves a lot of different technological components. If we're collecting biometrics, if we're using smart contracts, what blockchain protocols we're using, what platforms we're using, what cloud we're using to store it, which, here's a problem where we have a lot of centralized cloud in the world. So we have to think about this vertically, but we also have to think about this horizontally in how these ecosystems come in and out of the public and private sector. And if you are an issuer, a verifier, you're simply a passive, member of the ecosystem that's just benefiting from tapping into some of these ecosystems via an API that allows you to verify, a credit check or an employment check. So where do you fall under this ecosystem? And to me, if I think about it both vertically and horizontally, there's a lot of room for public-private collaboration. There's a lot of room for setting certain standards on minimum baseline of what can be verified and what needs to be present as data in order for verifiability to actually take place. So I think it's a big mix of things. I don't think one single private company can think and solve identification. I think it really has to be an ecosystem approach, and it has to really, really put private, public sector, and everything in between that at the same table, making sure that our function and our roles within both the horizontal and vertical collaborations of identity management can coexist in a way that is conducive to more benefits for the individual and more freedom for the individual as well.